Nabeel, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you very much for having me.
A poll released last year by Ipsos showed that many Canadians, I believe a little bit less than half, believe that there are too many immigrants in Canada. So in response, some people say, well, immigrants are successful in this country, immigrants bring jobs, they help the economy, they contribute to society. What's wrong? What do you think is wrong with saying those things?
Yeah, I think, if you think about the discourse that we have about immigrants, it's almost like we differentiate between those who are living here and those who come here from almost like their experiential perspective, right? So there's this narrative in which, somebody needs to be the good immigrant in order for them to come to Canada. The challenge with that discourse is that we are enforcing and imposing identities on people that are so much more than just an immigrant, right? A person who comes here from the various different countries are not coming here and are looking at themselves as an immigrant, right? It's an imposed identity that society places on who that person is. And then there's certain expectations that they're expected to conform to. So for example, the value that we place on a good immigrant is somebody who finds financial stability and security and gets a good job, right? But in trying to achieve that success, we don't provide them with the resources required to find financial stability, to find affordable housing, to put their children in places in which, they're able to integrate their culture into the Canadian society, not necessarily assimilate into it. And the struggle, you hear the stories of how many people are underemployed who are recent immigrants and who are struggling to make ends meet, and they continue to struggle, but society's expectation is on them to succeed without providing them with the resources, right? And a person who's an immigrant who has to conform now to this expectation, think about how exhausting it can be for that individual, right? So we're having this discourse in which we're dichotomizing the experience between you are a good immigrant because you're financially integrated and you're a bad immigrant because you're not, right?
And it's almost like you earned a place at the table and you didn't,
Right.
You're worthy because you're contributing and you're doing great, but the other person is not. Right.
Right, and we're making that decision as to how you're contributing based on the values that I am imposing on a person who is an immigrant, right? How much of their voices are we losing by not having them at the table say that, it's not all about economic integration, right? That's how we value immigrants. So think about if people valued us like that. If I valued you or you valued me based on my economic ability to contribute to society, right? And you can see the devastating consequences of when we do that, right? When we have this expectation that your value is only economic based, it's not socially based, it's not your contribution in terms of your civic engagement. You see how poverty becomes racialized within a community. And I keep bringing it back to Toronto because it is considered to be one of the most diverse communities in the world. But in Toronto, 71% of residents that live in low-income neighborhoods are people of color. So when you're putting these expectations on individuals to be financially viable and integrate, look at the consequences of that, right? It's not resulting in the expectation being met because people don't want to conform to their roles. They want to grow into them, right? And we're not letting newcomers and immigrants, we're not affording them that opportunity.
What do you think we need to do to get beyond that sort of trope, the good immigrant, the bad immigrant?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, at the end of the day, like empathizing with people's experiences, right? Recognizing that there's success in so many different avenues of life that's not just economically driven, right? A person who comes to a new country will inevitably struggle. I struggled when I first came to Canada. My parents struggled when they first came to Canada. So struggle is part of the reality of coming here, but it is not the only experience that an immigrant has. It's not the only contribution that a person can make is whether they're working a good job, right? An immigrant brings with them resiliency of just the ability to move to an entirely new country. They bring with
Which
them...
is extremely difficult.
Yeah, think about who's willing to do that? Am I willing to go to a country today, leave my job just for a better future of the unknowns? That's resiliency, that's skills that a person has, that's internal belief that needs to be celebrated, right? But when they come into this country and the immense amount of barriers, the systemic institutional barriers that they experience, it withers away their self-belief, it withers away their self-worth, and then they're left with this challenging position in which they're not only able to find material success, but now they're questioning their internal ability to meet the challenges that they experience. So I think what we need to do as a society is to empathize, is to recognize that we need to give voices to individuals because in their voices contains the solutions to the challenges that they experience, right? It's not about us imposing on them an identity and then expecting them to meet it. We know that that doesn't result in success. We need to give the voice to those who are here, who are coming here, who've chosen Canada as their home, and they're willing to struggle. We just need to make sure we give them the resources to get successful.
What's your advice to someone who came to Canada and is dealing with all those expectations and is struggling with their identity?
Yeah, the reality is you're going to struggle, right? So it's about embracing the struggle. It's about struggling smart, right? It's about recognizing that coming to a new country, you have to learn the culture of the land. You have to maybe even learn the language depending on your proficiency in English. You have to understand how the labor market works, but you are welcome here. And I think as a society, as people who have, if I've been here for 20 years in Canada, I need to understand that it's my responsibility to create a narrative in which newcomers that are coming to Canada understand that there's a struggle involved, but that struggle results in something fruitful. And it's not going to result in a perpetual struggle in which they're struggling with who they are, right? Canada is a land that accepts new immigrants, but we need to do a better job of making them feel at home, right? Not just an outsider that's coming in here. And that's our responsibility. That's a responsibility of every Canadian to ensure that while you're not necessarily letting them not struggle, because that's the reality of life, but you're alleviating additional sources of stress that causes them struggles that are not going to lead to something beneficial, right? It's just going to cause them in a perpetual cycle of poverty. It's going to marginalize them. As a society, that's not something that we can accept, especially when we're accepting 300 newcomers on a yearly basis, when our history is so rich with immigrants from all over the world, right? We have Chinese immigrants that have a rich history in Canada. We have Sikh immigrants that have a rich history in Canada. Swedish immigrants, they've been here for a very long time, right? And so this is a land of immigrants, which is so important for us to recognize, and also then understand that we are all immigrants technically in this land. The indigenous peoples of this land are those who were here first, and you can see in the way the indigenous peoples communities deal with immigrants, it's so different. There's so much love and compassion and understanding within those communities, and we need to leverage how indigenous peoples deal with newcomers as how we should all be dealing with newcomers.
I hope there will be a day when we don't reduce immigrants' identities just to one, and hopefully this will be part of the conversation. Thank you for that, Nabeel.
No problem.